Okay, so what we're going to do in this series, we're exploring what it means to be contemporary followers of Jesus within the context of the Anglican Church. So we're calling the series My Faith, My Life, My Church. And essentially, as you've seen, it's a program for people who are wishing to explore what a life centered around Jesus, the person and the teachings of Jesus, might look like. Especially if that way of being a disciple of Jesus is open always to new insights from the natural and social sciences. So we're always learning. To be specific, we embrace scientific proposals like evolution and the age of the universe and climate change, and we reject medieval and ancient classical concepts of the way the world works, the way humans relate to each other, and so on. So this has implications for our understanding of the universe, for our understandings of humanity and human nature, for our understanding of relationships, and also disciples of Jesus who are trying to be engaged with the wider community in compassionate action for the common good. So that's what the ethos of this program is, and that, of course, is the ethos of the Cathedral here in Grafton as well. So we're calling the program My Faith, My Life, My Church. And the first of the series, the first of the 6 sessions we're doing, is going to be on Anglican Christianity, but I'll quickly run over the others. Disciples of Jesus, which will be next week. The Bible, the role of the Scriptures in our lives as Christian people. Spiritual practice, particularly looking at the role of prayer, meditation, and other spiritual disciplines. The 5 marks of mission as Anglicans. What do we see as the work of the church? Why are we here? And finally, what it means to be committing ourselves to intentional discipleship. So that's where we're heading over the 6 weeks, and we're going to start with some thinking about Anglican Christianity. So we're thinking about what does the Anglican way of being Christian look like? We're not for a moment saying that Anglicans are the only Christians. We're not even saying in our better moments that Anglicans are the best expression of being Christian. We're simply saying that this is one of the ways of being Christian. So we're talking about some of the distinctive attributes of the Anglican way of being Christian. And we'll come back to this concept of the Anglican Communion in just a moment. So if we started by thinking, if we're trying to explain what an Anglican is, what an Anglican believes, what an Anglican does, how an Anglican might be different from a Catholic or a Baptist or a Lutheran, whatever, we end up, of course, with lots and lots of suggestions, lots and lots of ideas, but very little that's distinctively Anglican. But let's tease out some of the dynamics of this as we try to get a fix on what it means to be an Anglican kind of Christian. The first kind of cluster of ideas that I want us to think about is the point that Christianity is divided into various expressions of Christianity, and I want to make the point that it has always been divided into different expressions. If we go right back to the very earliest stage of Christianity in the decades immediately after Easter, not only was there a division between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, but there, as we know from the letters of Paul, there were people who aligned themselves with Paul. There were people who aligned themselves with Peter. There were people who aligned themselves with James. And each of these clusters of early Christianity are distinctive combinations of some of the elements of Christian discipleship. So the earliest stage after Easter, Christianity is already diverse, complex, and variegated. As Christianity becomes more established in the 2nd and 3rd through to the 4th century, we find rival centres of prestige and power and influence, particularly based on the major metropolitan cities. So the church in Rome, eventually the church in Constantinople, the church in Antioch in southern Turkey, northern Syria, the church in Alexandria in Egypt, the church in Caesarea in Palestine and so on, and to a lesser extent, even the church in Jerusalem. But really, Caesarea had more prestige than Jerusalem. These places had power and influence and privilege because they were major economic, cultural centres, and they were also centres of the major bishops or patriarchs. With the emergence of Constantine as the Emperor of Rome and the adoption or the very much the sort of co-opting of Christianity, we find a division between Christians within the empire, where there's a certain amount of imperially imposed uniformity, and Christians beyond the Roman Empire in places like Armenia, Northern Europe, also in the British Isles, and in other places in the Middle East, out towards the sort of Parthian Empire and so on. So there was a period of time, perhaps only 300 years or so, when Byzantine Christianity or Imperial Roman Christianity was one expression, dominant in the Mediterranean world, whereas beyond the fringes of the Roman Empire, there were non-Byzantine expressions of Christianity. Because there's a major split between East and West approximately 1,000 years ago, with the so-called Great Schism in 1054, and this was as much driven by cultural and linguistic differences as it was by theological differences. But officially, until very, very recent times, the Orthodox churches in the East and the sort of Latin-speaking churches in the West have been in formal schism, which has lasted now almost 1,000 years. Within the western part of Christianity, the next schism was, of course, the Reformation period. Think Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, etc. And this is really a north-south divide within the western half of the ancient Roman Empire. And one of the points to note is that the areas that stayed Catholic at the time of the Reformation were the areas which had always been under solid, uncontested Roman control, and the areas which broke away from Rome in northern Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, the British Isles and so on, were areas which had always been on the margins of effective Roman imperial control. So we have an East-West schism about 1000 CE, and we have a North-South schism within the Western Church around about 1500, actually 1517, and over the next few decades after that. Around about 100 years ago, the late 1890s through to the early 1900s, we've got the so-called modernist crisis and the rise of fundamentalism as a reaction to that. So as the cultural context of Western Christianity, and especially Protestant Christianity, really started to engage with science, with evolution, with genetics, and so on, astronomy and all the rest, we find there's a crisis over how literally to take the Bible and the status of various Christian doctrines. And so we have a more liberal, progressive, positive expression of Christianity which engages with these new sources of knowledge, and we have a reactionary response to that in what's known as the movement of Christian fundamentalism. So that's the background. Now, we're in a different space. Here's a photo from just a couple of years ago of Pope Francis visiting the Patriarch of Constantinople and acknowledging him and asking his prayers for his own ministry as Pope. A very significant moment of reconciliation, even if it has not yet broken down the divide between East and West. Similarly, here's the Pope, the same Pope, all of these photos will be the same Pope, last year celebrating the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther and the Lutheran Reformation. Who would have thought that the Pope would go to Germany to help celebrate 500 years of Lutheranism? This is a real sign of reconciliation. And we get a Guernsey as well. Here's a photo of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, meeting with Pope Francis in Rome. And again, a recognition that the relationship between the Anglican Communion and the Roman Catholic Church is much warmer in the last few decades than it had been for several hundred years following the time of Henry VIII. So let's drill this down now a little bit. Let's drill down and try to get a fix on what the Anglican Church in Australia looks like and how it sits in and amongst the other religious communities in our country. In the last census, which was just over 2 years ago, 52% of the Australian population identified as Christian. This, of course, is a significant drop over the last 2 or 3 or 4 census cycles, but we've now got just over 50% of the country identifying as Christian. Now, of course, identifying as Christian is not the same as being a Christian, but that's also probably a fairly risky kind of distinction to start making. According to the census data, 23% of the Australian population identified as Roman Catholics. Another 13% of the Australian population identify as Anglicans. So there's 36 out of the 52% are represented by Catholics and Anglicans. The Uniting Church, by the way, was down to about 3%. So if you took Catholics, Anglicans and Unitings, you get around about 40% of the Australian population. Another 5% describe themselves as Presbyterian or Reformed. So about 45% of the Australian population are either Catholics, Anglican, Presbyterian or Uniting, which means there's only 5 to 7% of the Australian population who identify as Christian Outreach Centre, Assembly of God, Baptist, New Life Church, Churches of Christ, and all those other smaller, more recent expressions of Christianity. They make a lot of noise, but actually most Australians do not identify with them. In terms of our local area, it's interesting, we're in a little bit of a time warp. In the same data, it says that 71% of the people in Grafton identify as Christian. Not only that, but 27% of the people in Grafton identify as Anglican. That would suggest that if you went across the road to the shopping centre, every 4th person who walks past you would identify as being Anglican. Okay? That's roughly 2,500 Anglicans just in Grafton. That's just on the north side of the Clarence River. 22% would identify as Catholics, that's roughly 1 in 5, and 34% say, I don't have any religion or I'm not going to answer that question. Okay, so again, if Anglicans and Catholics make up 49, virtually 50% of the population, and if no religion, no response makes up another 35% of the population, then there's only about 10 to 15% of people in Grafton to make up every other religious option, including Buddhists, including Pentecostal, including Baptist or whatever they're, Hindus, etc., etc. So that's where we sit nationally, but also locally, in terms of religious communities in Australia. We're not as significant numerically and percentage-wise as we used to be, but the Anglican Church nationally still makes up a significant 10-15% of the population, and locally more than a quarter of the population identify as Anglicans. This is just a more complete set of data comparing the changes in the 5 years from 2011 to 2016. And you can see 2011, the Catholics were the largest group, followed by No Religion and Anglicans. 2016, it was No Religion, followed by Catholic and Anglican and Uniting Church in that order. So still, we're up there in the top 3 religious communities in Australia and also locally. The cathedral itself, well, the parish has been here, of course, since 1842, and the cathedral has been here since 1884. When they built the cathedral, there were 1,500 people living in Grafton. So these were people with vision and who had confidence about the future for Christianity and for Anglicanism. So we try to position ourselves within the local community as a generous faith community. In other words, a community that wants to welcome and include people rather than find reasons to exclude them. We're not going to exclude people on the basis of their gender, of their sexuality, of their marital status, of their ethnicity, their employment status, their economic position, whatever. Part of our DNA is to be a church for everybody. Of course, we're centered on Jesus. It goes with being Christian, as we'll see next week. We're looking for wisdom for life. We're not selling fire insurance for the next life. We're looking for wisdom to live life well here and now. We're wanting to act with compassion. Drop the final N off there for some reason. We want to act with compassion and contribute to the well-being of our community. And we're very much in the heart of Grafton. Physically in the heart of Grafton, but hopefully the cathedral community can also be emotionally and psychologically at the very centre of Grafton's identity. And we've been doing that since 1842. So let's back up and try and get a bit of a sense of, well, how did the Anglican Church happen? What's the kind of historical background for this? And this, of course, there's not only a whole session in this, there are several sessions in this, but let's just very briefly touch on the headline issues. Firstly, as our name suggests, our origins lie in the British Isles, in England in particular, Angleterre, as the French would say. Our roots lie not only there, but they lie in an island culture. And people who live on islands are different from people who live on the mainland. So we're not just of European background, we're not just of British background, but we're an island culture off the coast of Europe, and always that's something of a vexed relationship, as the Brexit debates, of course, are showing to this day. Because of location, anybody living in Britain, Christians or pagans, were on the periphery of the Roman Empire. Rome was the dominant power, but Rome did not have effective control of most of the country most of the time. After the collapse of effective Roman presence in Britain, Celtic Christianity flourishes, and indeed the Celtic Christians go from Ireland and Scotland and Wales, and they spread Christianity through the northern part of Europe. So the northern areas of Europe, which later on would become Protestant, were actually missioned, they were evangelized by Celtic missionaries from the British Isles. And the Christianity in that part of Europe had never been centred or grounded in the Roman infrastructure. 597, Pope Gregory sent Augustine of Canterbury to Canterbury to set up the Roman Catholic hierarchy. He was called the Apostle to the English, or the Apostle to the Angles. And so from around about 600, you have parallel jurisdictions of the local indigenous Christianity, Celtic Christianity, and Roman Christianity imposed from without by the Pope. Roughly 1,000 years later, there was a brief pause. There was a peace deal between Celtic Christians and Roman Christians at the Council of Whitby in the 600s, and basically Roman Christianity dominated in England from that point. Crisis came, of course, with the Reformation in the 1500s and 1600s, where for political reasons as much as for any other reason, the Christian church in England separated itself from the church in Rome. The church in Scotland made a similar move, but for slightly different reasons. And as we all know, the church in Ireland, the Christians in Ireland, stayed staunchly Catholic because that was a way of being anti-English. And then from the 1600s through, but particularly in the 1700s and the 1800s, Britain found itself with a global empire. This little island state off the coast of France found itself the centre or the pinnacle of a vast empire spreading all the way around the world. And just as the Romans had to come to terms with having an empire in the first century, Anglicans or English people had to come to terms with having an empire. The very thing which they did not like about Europe, England now had an emperor, an empire, control of other people's lives. And so, as much by accident as any other reason, this phenomenon, this remarkable development called the Anglican Communion developed in different parts of the world. So that within a place like the United States of America, although the public society was no longer linked to the British Crown, there was nonetheless a healthy and vibrant Anglican church known as the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. So being Anglican is kind of something that happened to us rather than something that was thought about and planned. So today, the Anglican Communion is the third largest Christian community in the world, after Catholics and the Orthodox. It's found in more than 165 countries, even in countries that never had any kind of British imperial presence. It involves around 85 million people. When you get to this sort of number, it's really hard to count what kind of person is a member, what kind of person is just fudging the figures. But say 85 million people, something like that. Organised into 39 different provinces or national churches. And 80% of Anglicans are found in the so-called Global South, which means Africa, South America, and parts of Asia, which means the typical Anglican is not an Englishman and does not have white skin and blue eyes, and may not even speak English as their first language. Perhaps not the thumbnail sketch of Anglican Communion you might have been expecting. So that's kind of who we are and how we came to be. Then the next question is, so what do Anglicans believe? Are there any kind of beliefs that are typical or distinctive of Anglicans? So the first thing I want to say is that there's nothing that Anglicans believe that some other church doesn't also believe. Now, maybe there's nobody who has quite the same configuration of beliefs as we have, but whether it's about having bishops or sacraments or Eucharist or whatever, there's nothing that Anglicans believe which is distinctive on that basis. So we're not a confessional church. We don't exist because we believe this, and because we believe that, we can't go to those people's church. We're Anglicans because of how we choose to organise ourselves. And particularly that means the church has to be responsive and responsible at the local level in its own context. That's just what you'd expect people living on an island off the coast of France to say. So the Anglican Church describes itself as an apostolic church, a church whose roots go right back to the apostles. We're an apostolic church who holds the Catholic faith. We're not a Protestant church, an apostolic church that holds the Catholic faith. And every deacon and priest and bishop who's ordained has to take an oath that they agree with this description. We honour Reformation principles, so we're both Catholic and Reformed, but we're not Protestant in the normal sense of that word. And one of the ways in which that's evident is the fact that we have maintained the so-called historic episcopate. In other words, we kept bishops as the leaders of the church, and we've maintained the sacraments as being absolutely essential to our identity, our character, and our mission as Christians. So those are descriptions of what Anglicans are and what Anglicans believe. None of them are uniquely Anglican, other than perhaps the way that we organise ourselves in national and regional autonomous groupings. When conversations have come up about, well, if the Anglican Church was to merge with some other church, maybe the Methodist, maybe the Uniting Church, maybe this group or that group, what would be the non-negotiable elements for Anglicans? And we have what's called the so-called Lambeth, or strictly Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, just a box with 4 points. There has to be, we can only be a church, and we can only be part of a church which affirms the role of Scripture. We will remain committed to the historic creeds from the undivided church, which means the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and so on. We're maintaining the role of bishops as absolutely essential in the life of the church. This is clearly not something that every church would agree. And we've maintained our commitment to the sacraments, and particularly the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, as being these are the things which Christians do. We baptise, we gather at the table, we break the bread, we share the cup. So you can see straight away that even the Lambeth Quadrilateral is partly a statement of beliefs, but it's mostly a statement of practice. We will have bishops. We will celebrate the sacraments and so on. Practice is right up there alongside belief. So around the world, each local Anglican church is the grouping called the diocese, which has its own bishop. That, for an Anglican, is a local church. So the Diocese of Grafton, from Port Macquarie to Tweed Heads, is a local church. Not the parish of Grafton, not the parish of Port Macquarie, not the parish of Ballina. The Diocese of Grafton is the local church, and that's where everything has to be centred. That's where the decisions have to be made. Anyone who's a clergy, a deacon, a priest, or a bishop in that local church has to be ordained and licensed by a bishop. And even if I'm ordained somewhere else, as I was in Brisbane, I can only be a priest here if the Bishop of Grafton licenses me. Okay, I'm here with a piece of paper saying Greg is licensed by the bishop to do this particular job in the parish of Grafton. Another of the unique contributions which Anglicans made 100, 150 years ago, as the church found itself spreading outside of England and in contexts where it didn't have the infrastructure and the financial support of the ancient medieval inheritance, then lay people took a much bigger role in the life of the church. So whether it's in synod or whether it's in parish council, Anglicans lay people have a lot more influence, a lot more power, a lot more control over the life of the church than our neighbours in the local Catholic Church, for example, or the Greek Orthodox Church or whatever. One of the practices of Anglicans is that we've always been very connected to the cultural institutions of our own society. So ritual, music, education and the arts are all part of kind of an Anglican expression of Christianity. We know we can get by without all that stuff, but it's part of who we are to put on the best liturgy we can, to have the best music, to use dance, drama, to be engaged in scientific inquiry, not to be afraid of intellectual pursuit, and so on. The same cannot be said for some other church groupings. At the heart of being Anglican, and maybe this is a belief and maybe it's a practice, but it grows out of our focus on the sacraments, we've come to appreciate that God engages with us through the world in which we live. And so we have a very positive attitude towards the environment, towards our bodies, towards sexuality, and so on. We don't have a kind of ascetical approach, a world-denying approach. And this is known as the sacramental principle. The God who comes among us in the person of Jesus is a God who gets her hands dirty in the stuff of creation. And so we can expect to encounter God not only in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, but in the everyday business of daily life. And so historically and typically, Anglican churches engage constructively and positively with the wider society. And we're not in any sense a sect. A sect is a little religious group that has a very strong boundary and differentiates itself from the wider society. With Anglicans, sometimes it's even hard to see where the line might be between church and society. So these are representative practices. Again, they're not unique to Anglicans, but this cluster of practices is typical, and the cluster itself is distinctively Anglican. So let's turn then to Anglican identity. What does it mean to be an Anglican? Well, as we've said, our roots in the past are in the British Isles. In the Australian context, I go back to the First Fleet. Most Anglicans today are going to be found in Africa. Anglicans exist in both Catholic and Protestant forms. There are high church Anglicans and low church Anglicans. There are Anglicans that are closer to Catholics and Anglicans that are closer to Protestants. We're typically aging and shrinking in numbers, but we're also adapting and rediscovering ourselves and building new connections with the wider world. We see ourselves at our best as a local community within the wider Jesus movement. And if we can capture that idea, then I think we've captured the essence of being Anglican. So I hope that's helpful. Let's take some time now for questions and discussion and see where we go with all that.